Well, thinking this leads really to the a final topic that I want to talk with you about, and I think a very important one, looking at the future in the light of the past. If someone from a far distance were to look at China in 1977 or 1978, it could look over now nearly 3 decades of communist rule in which almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. Many areas of progress in the very early 1950s, but followed by the anti-rightist campaign, by the Great Leap Forward, by the Cultural Revolution. The rest of East Asia had gone forward dramatically over these nearly 30 years, and China had, from 1958 to 1978, essentially stagnated and gone, in comparative terms, dramatically backward. All of the promise of being the great power and the leading power of East Asia that seemed so obvious to many people around the world, even in 1945, before the revolution, seemed gone. No one, and I think it's absolutely fair to say no one in China or anywhere else could imagine China today in 1978, the second largest economy in the world, a global power, politically as well as militarily, a power whose word needs to be consulted on every matter, as it should be, on every matter of international importance. And if one were to have been told that China will become this extraordinary economic and global power, as it seemed poised to do earlier, but in 1978, and the Chinese Communist Party would still be in power, most people in the late 1970s would never have believed this. How do you account, if you can, for what you and others have called this kind of resilient authoritarianism in China? And how did the Chinese Communist Party make the most of this? One way I think of it is this extraordinary second chance.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. It really is the question of our day, I think, as we look at China. Certainly, my first experience in China, I was born there, but I have no memory of that, that initial experience. So I first went back in 1979 and lived there for a year, in 1979 to 1980. And was quite honestly very shocked when I first lived in China at how poor it was. I never could have imagined anything of the sort that has happened. I grew up in Japan, which also, of course, underwent a renaissance in the 1950s and early 1960s. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan in the 1960s and 70s, which also experienced an extraordinary developmental trajectory in that period. But what has happened in the PRC dwarfs these other very impressive experiences. So it really is extraordinary, and I would agree, although the economist Barry Naughton will say that economists certainly predicted a major development in China in the 1980s and 90s once it was willing to undertake market reform and to decollectivize. But nobody predicted, certainly, that that kind of development would occur under the auspices of a basically unreformed Communist Party state system. So it is a huge surprise. And I and my colleague at Trier University in Germany, Sebastian Heilmann, have attempted to provide an explanation for this puzzle in a book that we co-edited, and we entitled it Mao's Invisible Hand, suggesting that the secret of the amazing reform effort in China must be attributed not only to Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, which is obviously extremely important, simply the freeing up of the command economy and allowing Chinese economic forces to work their dynamic magic, but also that there was a hidden hand of Mao Zedong. On the one hand, you're certainly right that Mao is responsible for much of the destruction and the underdevelopment of China, beginning, depends how you want to date it, but certainly at least by the Great Leap Forward of 1958-59, China taking a path that slowed down its developmental trajectory in many respects. And yet, despite that fact, we believe that Maoism, by which we're just speaking in shorthand for some of the experiences of the Chinese Revolution, of the Communist Party that developed particularly during the wartime base areas against Japan, that there was a kind of flexibility, a kind of guerrilla policymaking, if you will, on the part of the Chinese Communist Party that's really quite different from what you saw in the former Soviet Union or in other communist parties that had not experienced a revolutionary tradition. That there is an interest in experimentation in the part of China. There's the whole vocabulary of experimental test points, or shidian. There's the vocabulary of taking something from a point, from one test area, and then expanding it, 从点到面. These ideas that you basically inductively or experimentally attempt a lot of things on the ground, and some of them work and some of them don't work. And those things that work, you can embrace as central policy and then take to another area, is in the DNA of the Chinese Communist Party. We believe that Mao squelched it with his own cult of personality at various periods in his own day. But his tremendous success as a guerrilla leader, and much of what he wrote after 1949 about healthcare, about education, and so on, represents this kind of experimental approach that we believe really came to full fruition in the post-Mao period. You're certainly right that when we look at China in 1977, 78, we compare it to the other East Asian countries. We think, wow, China wasn't doing terribly well in this period under Mao. On the other hand, our colleague Amartya Sen has made a rather interesting different comparison with China, not to the other East Asian developmental states, but to India. And there he argues, I think quite persuasively, that if you look at India and China at two crucial junctures in history, 1948-49, when both of these new states are set up, and then 1978-79, 30 years later. Most people in 48-49 would have predicted that India would have well outdone China on most indicators, partly because India was and is a democracy. Partly because at that early stage, although they're kind of similar in a lot of ways, but India actually had more in the way of industrial investment and so on than China. And yet, if you look at those two countries at the end of the Cultural Revolution, in this period where, as you say, all this destruction had been visited on China, nevertheless, literacy rates and life expectancy rates had both gone way, way up in China. I think the fastest increase of those in history, or certainly one of the fastest, and India's had remained basically stagnant. And his argument is that that difference in human capital between the two Asian giants really helps explain why it is that once China took a more enlightened view of development, it actually had the human capital to be able to accomplish amazing things in the 1980s and 90s. In that same period, India also attempted a whole series of neoliberal market reforms, and yet its record of achievement has been much more sluggish than that of China. So it is a very complicated history. I would say, even the history of the Mao period. On the one hand, we see the worst famine in all of human history, absolutely horrendous. On the other hand, this surprising improvement in literacy and life expectancy, and also all through the Cultural Revolution, a steady growth in industrial output. Not as good as it could have been under different circumstances, as we quickly discovered. But while agriculture was stagnating, industry, still under a very Soviet model of heavy investment in heavy industry, nevertheless continued to make progress. And without that kind of foundation, I think it is very hard to imagine that we would have gotten this big burst in the post-Mao period. So from my point of view, the Maoist legacy is an extremely complicated one, in which on the one hand, we have these various revolutionary strategies, quite ruthless, but at the same time have a certain pragmatic, efficient side to them that has been very beneficial to the Communist Party over its history. And on the other hand, the Mao era itself sees some of the most inspiring and some of the most horrific examples of human development and underdevelopment that we've seen, certainly in the 20th century, and in fact in much of history.
It actually is a wonderful metaphor, and one that we should all think about. Mao's invisible hand to be seen in the political system, but also in many ways in the economic system, in at least giving the foundations of the human capital that could be educated to go on to higher education in the great expansion that we see today, the high literacy rates, the longevity of the Chinese people, those who live in any event. So it's a remarkable metaphor, yet another of Professor Perry's books that has had a big impact on our study of modern China. Elizabeth Perry, Director of the Harvard Yenjing Institute, and Henry Rosofsky, Professor of Government. 非常感谢.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.